The dragon sacrifice was where kingdoms sent the women they wanted gone. Miranda lay on her back on a stone altar that had been built for the slow tribute of livestock, and she catalogued the situation with the precision of a woman who had decided that being eaten was no excuse for sloppy observation. The altar was cold through the thin white dress they had bathed and dressed her in, the kind of cold that did not chill the body so much as remind it whose property it was. Her wrists were bound across her stomach, her ankles were bound at the rope's other end. Around her, arranged in careful little heaps, were pumpkins and yams and carrots, as though she were a course on a banquet plate and the kingdom had wanted to be polite about the garnish. The pumpkins were, she noted, of unusually high quality. She found that she was annoyed by this. She did not know why. There was simply something in her that refused to be accompanied to the grave by mediocre vegetables, and the kingdom had at least gotten that part right, and she resented the courtesy of it. Above her, the stars were not the stars of a girl's life. They were the stars of someone who had no further use for them. She looked anyway, because a person had to look at something, and the alternative was the dark seam of trees where the dragon would come from. She had decided, 3 steps inside the forest, that she would not scream. She had decided this for herself, not for the soldiers, who were already walking faster than men should have walked. The decision had cost her nothing. Fear had drained out of her at some earlier hour and left behind only this strange administrative calm, this woman lying tidy on a stone in her clean dress, taking inventory. She had not eaten in 3 days. She had not slept in 2. She had not, since the night of the ball, allowed herself to weep where any servant could see. None of these were complaints. They were the entries in a ledger she was keeping for no one. Then the ground shook. A long, heavy tremor came up through the stone and entered her shoulder blades and her hips and the back of her skull, and she understood that there was nothing to be done about any of it. Something was coming, something with weight. The trees made the small, reluctant noises of trees getting out of the way of a body that did not have to ask them. She closed her eyes. She had decided not to look at its face. Wet, snorting breath. The hot smell of an animal that had run a long way without tiring. The shuffle of something settling its weight at the foot of the altar. Then a sound she had not braced for at all. A loud, satisfied, splitting crunch. Then another. It ate the pumpkin first. Miranda kept her eyes closed and felt her whole understanding of her own death rearrange itself. She was apparently not the entree. She was apparently somewhere lower on the menu. The dragon was working through the side dishes with what could only be described as enthusiasm, and behind that wet, occupied chewing came another sound entirely, a sound that did not belong here. A man's voice. Warm, amused. "Easy, Scorpio. Slow down. Yes, I know. Pumpkin is your favorite." It was the voice you used on a beloved dog. It was the voice of someone who had never been afraid of the thing he was speaking to. Bootsteps came around the altar, unhurried, and stopped. There was a small breath, a startled one, then, lifted half an octave higher than the same voice had been a moment before. "There is a human girl on the altar." The dragon stopped chewing. The forest did the courtesy of going quiet with it. A shadow leaned in over her. She could feel its attention before she felt anything else, the way you feel weather before you feel rain. Her spine recognized something her mind had not yet seen. She opened her eyes. The first thing the night gave her was hair the color of the deep blue sky between stars, falling forward in long, unhurried strands. Then the eyes. 2 of them, gold, set in a face that did not seem entirely sure it was supposed to be making the expressions it was making. The brow had drawn into something concerned. The mouth had not yet decided what it was. A red gem clasped the throat of a long forest cloak. The thing she would remember last, because her brain refused to put it first, was the pair of small dark horns swept back along the crown of his head. He was looking at her as though she had been left there by accident, and the accident was somehow his. "You are not dead," he said, after the kind of pause a person took when speaking to themselves. "You are very pale, but you are not dead." She would have said something dignified. She would have introduced herself. She would have done several things in a particular order, the way a marquess's daughter is taught to do them, and instead, her mouth said the only question that still mattered. "Are you going to eat me?" His face, for one bright second, did not know what to do. No, that is, eat is. Of course there are things, but you are." He stopped. He started again. He drew himself up with an effort she could see, and said, with the dignity of a man recovering from a small fall in public, "There is a proper order to these things. You are not a side dish. You are clearly a bride." She blinked at him. "I am clearly a what?" "You are the bride," he said. The humans finally had the sense to send. She had not been eaten. She had been promoted. She did not know which of these constituted the worse misunderstanding. "My wrists," she said, because her wrists were the part of her that had begun very politely to stop being her wrists. He moved. There was suddenly a small, neat blade in his hand, and the rope at her wrists parted as cleanly as paper, and then the rope at her ankles, and he stepped back as though her body were something he did not have the right to crowd. He watched her sit up. He watched her flex her fingers and find them again. He did not offer her a hand until she swayed, and then his palm was simply there, broad and steady, and she put her hand into it, because that was what one did with a hand that was offered. He was warm, improbably warm, like a stove banked for a long winter. "Your eyes," he said, and stopped and tried again. "Your eyes are like a night rose." It was the worst time and the best time to be told a thing like that. She looked up at him because she could not quite help it, at the long blue hair and the gold eyes and the small swept-back horns that he was wearing as if he had forgotten he had them, and she said calmly, "The truth." "You are more beautiful." His chin lifted. He worked very hard at appearing unmoved. The corner of his mouth did not cooperate. "Where?" he said. "Hair. Eyes. The horns are also very nice." "You are not afraid of the horns." "No." He looked away first, down at the altar, where the pumpkins lay open in slick orange ruin, then back at her, with the expression of a man making a decision he had clearly already made hours ago. "I am Lucian Dragonia, King of Dragons." "I am Miranda. Miranda." He tested it once, as though the syllables had a temperature. "There is a castle beyond the forest. I will take you home." Home, she chose. In the half-second she had to herself to interpret that as a place rather than a promise. It was easier to walk toward. He set his hand on the great red flank of the dragon, and the dragon, who had been the size of a barn and the shape of an apocalypse, lay down in the moss like a polite spaniel. Lucian guided her up onto the warm armored ridge of its back, as though it were a carriage step and she were a guest at a dinner she was an hour late for. He settled in behind her. His arm came around her waist to take the rein. He did not lean into her. He did not need to. The line of his chest behind her shoulder blades was its own statement. "Hold on," he said. She held on. The dragon rose. The forest fell away. Her stomach, which had been quite well behaved through most of an execution, finally made its small, graceless protest, and she heard a sound come out of her that was not anything like a scream and not anything like a laugh. Below them, the altar grew small. The pumpkins grew smaller. Burials bored her. The kingdom that had stripped her of her name and her future and her father's protection in one night fell behind them in the dark. Her chest did something it had not done in a long time. Not warmth. Not yet. More like a door, Hinges remembered, cracking on a room she had not been allowed inside in years. She would catalog it later. She cataloged everything later. For now, the night was cold, and the king behind her was not, and somewhere in the dark ahead of them, something was waiting that called itself a home. The flashback was hers, in the same way the dungeon had been hers. She did not relive it. She filed it, several weeks before the altar, before the rope, before the pumpkins. There had been a ballroom. There had been music. There had been her own name, said in a voice she had known her whole life, Joseph's, clean and ringing across the marble, but said the way you said the name of a thing you intended to discard. Miranda, every shred of evidence for the assassination plot you devised has been gathered. The music stopped. People stopped. Somewhere in her stomach, a long, hollow chord struck and would not stop sounding. Beside Joseph stood Fina, the saint of prophecy, in white robes she had earned by being precise about other people's disasters. She lifted her open hands toward the painted ceiling like a woman receiving the sky. I have seen it, Your Highness. I have seen the Lady Miranda crafting poisons. I have seen her laying snares for the lives of the royal house. Joseph held up a small vial. From her own room, he said, from her own dresser. He did not look at her face when he said it. And further, Fina said, soft and careful and unhurried, she has used the magic of charm upon you, my prince, to keep her place at your side. Your gentleness has been turned against you. Miranda had taken one step forward. She had said, wait. She had been allowed exactly that one word. Then the guards. Then the corridor. Then a stranger in livery reciting a list of crimes she had not committed, in a voice trained to make the reading sound official. She had been accused, convicted, and delivered in less than 2 weeks, which was efficient if nothing else. Her father had been informed. Her father had not come. A marquess managed his daughters the way he managed his estate, with an accountant's eye for what could be saved and what should be written off, and Miranda had been written off in a single afternoon by a man who had once held her hand across a carriage seat and called her clever. She was 17. Her dress, on the way to the dungeon, had still smelled of perfume. The dungeon itself she remembered with a certain administrative detachment. Stone floor, one bed, bread that did not yield to the teeth, soup the color of dishwater. The maid who refilled her pitcher would not raise her eyes. A nervous girl from the laundry caught a comb in Miranda's hair on the morning of the sentence and almost spoke. The older maid hushed her instantly. Fina's reach was already inside the walls. The dungeon had been more comfortable than she had expected. That was not a compliment to the dungeon. Fina had proposed the sentence personally. The saint had declared, in front of the whole court, that the wicked Miranda would have the chance to redeem herself by securing peace with the dragons. Miranda's offering, Fina explained with downcast eyes, would lead the kingdom into prosperity. Joseph had nodded as though this had been spoken by God. A girl could be undone in a night by a story. That was what Miranda had learned. The story did not have to be true. It only had to be told by the right person to the right room, and the right room would believe it because the right room had wanted to. She had stopped explaining. She had walked to the carriage with her chin up. She had not given Fina the gift of seeing her break. That had been the only thing she had managed to keep. The castle was on a hill in the deepest part of the forest, and a single dark cloud sat over it like an animal that had decided to live there. Rain came down in solid sheets onto the tower roofs, the courtyards, the steps, the lampposts. Around the castle, the forest was dry, lit silver at its edges by the moon. Above the castle, weather. Lucian opened a long black umbrella with the practiced motion of a man for whom this was not unusual and held it over Miranda's head. Mostly Miranda's head. He himself was already wet to the shoulders. It rains here, he said, on only your castle. I have a small problem with the weather. She looked up at the cloud above them, then at him. "You are doing this." "Not on purpose." The front door swung open before he reached them. Standing in the doorway, frowning up at her with the alert precision of a child who had been left too long in charge of his elders, was a slight, silver-haired boy in a tidy little waistcoat with two soft horns at his temples and the most perfectly composed 8-year-old face she had ever seen. His eyes flicked to her. His eyes flicked to Lucian. His eyes flicked back to her. "My lord, from where exactly did you abduct her?" "Arlo," Lucian said. "I did not abduct her." "My lord, this is a human woman. She is the bride. The humans finally sent one." Arlo absorbed that. Arlo did not move his small face by any measurable amount, but a quiet calibration occurred behind his eyes. He bowed to Miranda with the bow of someone who had practiced it in a mirror. "A pleasure, my lady. I am Arlo. I am the most recent of his foundlings. I keep notes." "You keep notes," Miranda said. "I will be keeping notes about you presently." She had been on a stone altar 3 hours earlier, and a child with horns was now formally announcing his intention to put her on a list, and the rain on the great front hall behind him sounded like a kept promise. Her chest did the small considering thing it had been doing since the altar, the door cracking, the door deciding. The castle inside was a wonder and a wreck. Tribute had filled it past sense. Statues, tapestries, lacquered chairs, vases, a brass orrery, 2 harps, a stack of carved chests, a marble bust set on a stack of books, a marble bust set on another marble bust. There were paintings leaning 4 deep against the walls because the walls had run out. There was a corridor she could not see because someone had set a settee crossways in it. The room had been built for grandeur, and the gifts of 7 kingdoms had reduced grandeur to clutter. "Your wedding gifts, my lady," Arlo said, with grave courtesy, gesturing at the entire ground floor. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She had not planned that far ahead. She had been about to make a polite remark about the orrery when the floor came up to meet her, her knees folded as cleanly as they had at the altar. There was no decision in it. Her body had remembered finally that it had not slept in 2 days and not eaten properly in 3, and her body had cashed the bill. She did not hit the floor. There was a sudden rush of motion, and then her shoulders were braced against something warm and broad, and her feet were no longer on the stone, and a low voice was saying her name once, sharply. "Miranda." "I am sorry," she said, with all the dignity she could find. "I appear to be very tired." "Arlo." "The bedroom." "Yes, my lord." He carried her up a staircase he could barely navigate because the floor of the staircase was occupied by a porcelain leopard. She felt him swearing under his breath at the porcelain leopard. She felt the heat of him against her side, improbably warm, the way a stove is warm to a body that has been cold for days. His arms were not gentle. They were not rough. They were certain, the way a man was certain about a thing he was carrying that was very, very valuable to him for reasons he had not stopped to examine. "Heavy," she said, attempting humor. "Carrying the bride," he said, without looking at her, "is the husband's part." The bed, when she reached it, was too soft. That was Miranda's last thought before sleep took her, and even as it took her she filed it. Too soft. Not the dungeon. She woke to birdsong. That was the first indication that she was not in the dungeon. The second was the rain. Light now, almost decorative, falling outside her window the way rain falls in books. Someone had put a blanket over her. It was very large, as though whoever did it had calibrated for a significantly larger person. It smelled like lightning. Her chest ached in a way she could not quite locate. Not a wound, not the rope, something older. Then she recognized it. Relief. It still worked, apparently. The dining hall, when Arlo led her down to it, was a small museum that had decided to also be a kitchen. Sunlight came through tall windows recently rinsed by Lucian's storm. The table was laid with a clean white cloth and dishes that did not match each other, and, in the center of all of it, breakfast. A perfect omelet, steamed vegetables in a green sauce, a bowl of golden soup, and, set on its own small plate, bread shaped like a rose. She sat down because Arlo had pulled out the chair and because she did not entirely trust her knees. I steamed the vegetables. My lord made the omelet and the bread. The Dragon King, she said, made the bread. My lord makes cake. He makes meat. He learned because I came to live here. Arlo's voice did not change at all. I was small. I needed nutrition. My lord taught himself. He pretends he did not. I am noting this for the record. The rose-shaped bread was still warm. She broke it. The crust gave a soft, yielding sigh, and the smell that came out of it was warm and sweet and made of butter, and her mouth, which had been an obedient diplomatic instrument for 17 years, betrayed her completely. "It's so good," she said, full of bread. Lucian, across the table, set down his fork and looked at her as though she were a sunrise. She ate. She ate ravenously, the way a body that had been emptied for a week eats when food is finally put before it. She ate the omelet. She ate the soup. She ate the rose. She ate the second piece of the rose Arlo placed silently on her plate. Halfway through this, she became aware that she had a witness and tried to slow down and could not slow down. Her body was making the decisions now. She was simply watching. When she had stopped, her cheeks were burning and there was butter on her thumb. She wiped it carefully. She drew a breath. "Forgive me. The food in the dungeon was not, perhaps, what one would call food." "The dungeon," Lucian repeated. His voice had gone very flat. Outside, the light dimmed. The rain that had been polite returned to itself, heavy now, and then heavier, and then not rain at all, but a wall of falling water hammering the roof. A flash of white split the sky. Thunder followed at half a heartbeat. The chandeliers shook on their chains. "My lord," Arlo said calmly, from beside the soup tureen. "They sent her to be eaten." Lucian was on his feet. The teacup on the table beside his hand had gone over without him touching it. Tea was running across the cloth in a slow brown ribbon. His eyes had gone gold, the way light goes gold when it is the source of a fire. They tied her with rope and dressed her with vegetables, and they sent her into my forest to be eaten. "My lord, the roof! I will drown the kingdom of burial until salt grass grows on the stones of its capital. My lord, the roof!" A blast of lightning struck the great oak on the far side of the courtyard. The sound was a building falling down. The candles in the chandelier guttered, and one of them came loose and clattered onto the cloth. The rain was beating sideways now. Somewhere in the castle, a door slammed open of its own accord. Miranda, who had survived her own conviction 3 nights in a dungeon and a dragon sacrifice, was apparently going to lose her composure over breakfast tea. She stood. Her legs held her this time. She set down her napkin. Lucian. He was already not entirely Lucian. The horns at his temples had gone glossy and dark. His teeth, when he opened his mouth to begin another sentence about burial, were briefly too sharp. The whole room felt as though it had been dragged a step closer to the storm. Arlo was standing very still by the tureen, with the patience of someone who had been here before, and who had learned that the right thing to do was wait. She set her hand lightly on the back of her chair. She did not raise her voice. "Thank you for the bread." The lightning paused. "It was the best thing I have eaten in my life. Thank you." The thunder, which had been gathering for another rolling answer, did not come. Outside, the rain thinned, then thinned again, then stopped. The light in the windows changed by degrees, a long, slow brightening, until the whole dining hall stood in plain, warm afternoon sun, and the wet leaves outside steamed on their branches, and Miranda was standing in light. Lucian closed his mouth. He sat down. He picked up his napkin and put it on his lap as though that were the correct order of things. He did not look at her. The tips of his ears, where they showed beneath the dark blue hair, had gone the color of red wine. Arlo, by the soup tureen, raised one careful eyebrow, then very deliberately did not comment. That was the comment. Miranda sat back down. She picked up her teacup. She drank her tea. She found that she could feel her own pulse in her throat and had no intention whatsoever of examining why. "More tea, my lady?" Arlo said. "Yes, please." He poured. The sun outside held. The forest in daylight was nothing like the forest at night. Sunlight moved between high branches in long, soft bars. Wildflowers leaned on each other in the meadows. Bees did the work, bees did, and on rocks, in clearings, draped over the warm stones, were dragons. 5 of them she counted in the first quarter-mile, 6, 8, most no larger than ponies, one as broad as a barn, one curled like a cat sleeping in the sun. They lifted their heads when Lucian passed and laid them down again with the lazy reverence of large animals who had decided, long ago, that this man was theirs. "They will not eat you," Lucian said, when she stayed 2 paces behind him. "That is what people say. They are mine. They obey me. That is also what people say." He glanced back at her with something very nearly a smile. She walked closer. She walked closer than that. A young blue-gray dragon, the size of a hunting hound, had lifted its head from the moss and was watching her the way a dog watches a guest with pockets. Lucian put his hand on its long neck, and the dragon pushed its head into his palm with a soft thrumming sound. "This is Spica. She would like to be admired." Miranda admired Spica. Spica regarded her for a long deliberate moment, decided in her favor, and laid her great triangular head on Miranda's foot. Ahead of them on the path, Arlo moved through the low growth with his herb basket like a small, precise official. He plucked a sprig here, 2 leaves there. He named them as he went, half to himself, half to her. Thyme, wild garlic, rosemary, fool's parsley, never that one. "What is fool's parsley?" "A plant," Arlo said, "for fools." She said she would help. She held out her hand for the basket. She set out into the underbrush with the determination of a woman who had managed an entire household at 15 and would not be defeated by a salad. She returned to the path with a confident armful of green. Arlo lifted the basket out of her reach. "My lady, no." "What?" "That is poison." "It is the same shape." "The shape, yes. The root, no. You would have killed us all." She looked down at her bouquet of murder. She looked up at Arlo, who was wearing the most careful, neutral face she had ever seen on a small person. She had a brief and very pointed wish to be, immediately, someone whose chief embarrassment of the day was something other than nearly seasoning dinner with a herb whose chief property was death. "Well," she said, "at least the leaves were colorful." She knelt. She set the herbs back where she had found them. Then a hand closed lightly around her wrist and lifted, and she straightened, and Lucian was there, holding her hand palm up, brushing the dirt from the heel of her hand with the careful concentration of a man working on a clock. His fingers were warm. They were unreasonably warm. "The bride's hand," he said, "is dirty." "I am very sorry." "There is nothing to be sorry about." He did not lift his eyes from her hand. An honest woman who cannot tell a herb from a poison is the very last sort of person who could have made one. "You believe me. I have eyes. Other people had eyes." "Other people," Lucian said, "are fools." He had finished brushing the dirt away. He had not let go. Her fingers, which had been numb on the altar, which had been bruised in the dungeon, which had spent 3 days clenched into a kind of armor she had stopped noticing, slowly understood that they were being held. There was no other word for it. He had not asked. She had not protested. The space between them, which had been the proper space between a king and a stranger, had quietly stopped being that space, and neither of them had marked the change out loud. Her spine remembered something it had been forgetting for years. A shiver moved up it, slow, deliberate. Not fear, not cold. Something else, with no name yet, that she had no intention of naming in a forest while her hand was being held by a man who had cooked her a rose. Behind them, 20 feet away, one of the larger dragons noisily ate a pumpkin. The moment broke. It did not break clean. A piece of it stayed. "Why?" she said carefully. "Do you trust me? You did not run. From you. From any of it." She thought about that. She thought about it the way a careful woman thought about a bridge she was being asked to walk across. "Lucian," she said, "do you believe me about the poison, about the charm, about the things they said?" He looked at her. The afternoon was on his face, and the gold in his eyes was very steady. "I believe you, and if you ever, by accident, feed me one of these little green murders by mistake, I am unlikely to die of it." A laugh came out of her before she could prevent it. Short, surprised, undignified, the first laugh in a number of weeks she could not bring herself to count. He did not let go of her hand on the way back to the castle. The forest, which on her arrival had been a black wall, was, on the way home, full of small sleepy dragons who watched her pass with mild curiosity, and one of them, a young thing with clouded blue eyes, walked along behind her for a quarter of a mile. She had not been eaten. She was beginning, slightly, to suspect that she was not going to be. Arlo had taken his blue dragon and gone to market. Lucian had taken himself into the kitchen and a flour-dusted apron. The castle, for the first time, was hers to wander. Miranda walked the parlor with the slow attention of a woman who could not quite say why she was looking. Tribute leaned everywhere, a brass orrery the size of a hat box, a string of carved ivory wolves, a folding screen painted with cranes, a clock with no glass. She passed her hand over each in turn, the way a person tested fabric for water damage. Most of them felt like what they were: beautiful dust. Old kindness. 3 of them did not. She stopped at the third. A music box, small enough to hold in 2 cupped palms, lacquered black with a stem of inlaid silver lilies running up the side. Lovely. Outside, a small breeze moved one of the curtains. Inside her, something objected. She lifted it. The objection grew. It was not a smell and not a sound. It was the way a room felt when someone had been arguing in it half an hour before you walked in, even after the people were gone. She turned it in her hands. She turned the little brass key. The lid popped open. A tiny silver dove on a wire began to revolve very prettily to the first 3 bars of a song she did not know. The cold came out of it, not a draft. The room was warm. This cold traveled up the inside of her wrists and into her elbows and stopped at her sternum, and her sternum understood. She knew this cold. The dungeon had this cold. The bath water that had been left to her in the dungeon had been this cold. It was cold in a way cold could not account for. Her fingers loosened before her brain told them to. The box hit the marble at her feet and broke open along a seam, in a soft, tinkling shower of brass and lacquer and tiny shrugged-off pieces of itself. She crouched. She brushed the splinters apart with the back of one hand. There, on the underside of the lid, where the lining had pulled back, was a strip of vellum no longer than her finger. Inked onto it, in small, careful, deliberate strokes, were 3 lines of script she had been raised to recognize. A curse. The kind of binding script the burial courts had outlawed her grandfather's grandfather's lifetime ago, the kind she had only ever seen in her own father's reference books, the kind a person wrote when they wanted a death and did not care to be in the room when it happened. The cold she felt in her chest was sister to the cold of the dungeon, and that was the whole of what her body could put into words. Bride, he was in the doorway, apron, flower on his cheekbone, hair pulled back in a pony's tail because he had been working with his hands. What is wrong? She held out the strip of vellum on her palm. This was inside. There are more. I don't know how many. The pieces I touched in this room, 3 of them feel like this. I think there are more in the other rooms. He came across the room in 2 strides. He did not take the vellum from her. He looked at it. He looked at her face. He looked at her hands. You can feel it. It is not a power. I think anyone could feel that. You can feel it. Other humans cannot. Outside, weather darkened. The light in the room dimmed by a degree, then another. The curtain that had been moving stopped moving. Something began to happen at the very back of her shoulder blades, as though the air itself had remembered it had a job. Lucian, she said carefully, it is all right. We will throw them out. Yes, he said. He took the vellum out of her hand. He folded it, very precisely, between his thumb and forefinger. Then he walked out of the parlor and into the great front hall and lifted his face to the high vaulted ceiling and called. What he called was not language she knew. It was not a word. It was the sound a dragon made when a dragon was telling other dragons something important, and it traveled, low and rolling and not loud, out through the open castle doors and into the forest. The forest answered. From far away, from much closer, a great chorus of small thrumming sounds and one enormous bass note like a struck bell. The first dragon came over the wall 10 minutes later. The second one came down on the lawn. The third was at the door before she could rise to her feet from where she had crouched on the parlor floor. Ares, the bride, with me. A white dragon with the soft, thick wool of a winter ram came up the front steps and lay down beside Miranda like a couch agreeing to be a couch. Lucian put his hand briefly to the warm, white shoulder. Outside, wing on her until I call. The wing came over her. Her face hit a wall of wool and she rebounded gently. She tried to push the wing aside and the wing pushed her back, mildly, the way a mother pushed a child away from a hot stove. She got an indignant breath of fleece and a very large lash-fringed eye looking at her with maternal regret. Behind her, in her castle, the work began. She did not see it. She could only listen. The sound of every drawer being opened and emptied, the sound of every shelf being cleared, the sound of dragons, dozens of them, being directed by short, low, certain commands, the sound of glass and wood and brass and silver and porcelain leaving rooms by the armful and being passed out of windows into waiting claws, the sound of a man working with his teeth set. It went on for an hour. It went on for 2. The sun moved across the floor of the front hall and reached the toes of her slippers and kept going. She tried twice more to get past Ares, and Ares swatted her gently back into her woolen cradle, and she thought, with the dry calm of a woman who had spent a week being delivered to her own death, that she had now been hand-luggaged into a soft animal corner by a polite white dragon, and she was going to have to write that down somewhere. When Arlo came back down the path with his market basket, he stopped. He looked at the white dragon. He looked at Miranda's face, peering between 2 enormous tufts of wool. What, he said, with great care, are we doing? Your lord, Miranda said, her voice slightly muffled, is having a moment. Ah! Arlo touched the wing. The wing folded. Miranda stood. She straightened her dress and discovered she had wool in her hair. Together, they walked into the castle. It was empty, not empty of furniture. The castle had a few sofas and a long table and the chairs that had always lived under the chairs. It was empty of tribute. The walls, which had been blocked, were stone. The floors, which had been mazes, were floors. Sunset fell through the tall windows onto polished granite that had not seen direct light in 11 years. Lucian came in from the courtyard, dust on his shoulders, dust in his hair, dust where his ears had gone wine red the day before. I have returned everything to its kingdoms, every gift, every tribute. Some of them are presently being placed on royal lawns by dragons. Some of them are being placed on royal heads. She stared at him. I sent it back, he said again, as though she had not heard. You sent it all back. I will not keep gifts from people who would put a curse in my house. He looked at her then. His chin came up. The set of his jaw was the set of a man who had said all the words he was prepared to say on a topic, and was now waiting to see what she did with them. And nothing in this house, he said, will ever again be capable of harming what is mine. She could not feel her knees. She had spent a great deal of time today not feeling parts of her body, but this was new, not numbness. The opposite. Her chest was the most alive it had been since she had been a girl. She crossed the floor on legs that were not entirely under contract, and when she reached him, she leaned against his chest. Just that. Forehead to the dusty front of his shirt, the warmth of him familiar now, the way a stove is familiar when you have decided not to be cold anymore. She felt his arms come up, his hands hovered, then settled, very lightly, between her shoulder blades. His fingers were trembling. She did not say so. She closed her eyes against his shirt and felt the small, steady tremor of a man who had just emptied his entire house because an unfamiliar piece of paper had been rude to her, and who was not presently going to admit that his hands were shaking. The smell of him was bread and dust and a clean burning thing she had no word for. Behind them, Arlo set his basket on the floor. He looked at the empty hall. He looked at his employer. He looked at his employer's bride. He sighed. My lord, you are very dramatic. Yes, Arlo, I shall make tea. Yes, Arlo. The white dragon Ares, now visible through the open door, lay on the front lawn, looking pleased with herself. That night, Lucian gave her a word she had never heard, said as though it were a sacred thing. The bath, he announced. Spica will take you. The bath was in fact a body of water in the middle of a forest, and the body of water was hot because beneath the rocks underneath it slept a fire dragon with no plans to stop. Arlo handed her a basket of soaps and a robe and a clean nightgown with the gravity of a man performing a wedding ceremony. Spica, the blue dragon with the gold eyes, set her down at the edge with great delicacy, then turned her back like a duenna. Miranda had taken many baths in her life. She had not taken any like this. The water folded around her in a way water was not supposed to be able to fold. She made a sound that was not at all dignified. She made a second sound, also not dignified, and decided that no one was watching except a dragon, and the dragon was on her side. She lay back. The stars over her head came out one by one as though they had been waiting for permission. Steam rose off her shoulders. Her spine, which had been tight as a wound clock since the night of the ball, unwound a turn. It unwound another. It unwound entirely. Her eyes burned. She let them. There was no audience for it, but a very kind dragon and the steam would not gossip. She did not let the burning become anything more. She had not earned that yet. She had not even given herself permission to call what she felt by its name. She turned her head to look at Spica. The dragon had a long, sweet face and lashes you could weave a basket out of. The gold eyes, in this light, were exactly the color of the gold eyes of someone else. Miranda, who had been raised to keep her counsel and had kept it scrupulously since she was 9 years old, took a breath of warm, wet air and broke open. I think I love him, Spica blinked. I am telling you because there is no one else in this entire forest I can tell, and you are very pretty and you do not gossip, and I have spent 2 weeks in his house, catching myself watching the doorway for him to come through it. Spica blinked again, slowly, the kind of blink you got from a friend who was waiting for you to say the next part. I have been told my whole life that I am proud and difficult, and that my eyes are wrong, and that my mouth is wrong, and that my way of standing is wrong. I have been told by people who said they loved me. I have been delivered to an altar by people who said they loved me. He has not said he loves me. He has not said any word that could be tested in court, and he made me bread shaped like a rose spixa. He threw out an entire kingdom of treasure because it might have hurt me. He carried me up his own staircase, trying not to swear at a porcelain leopard. The steam in front of her face moved. I am in a hot spring in a dragon forest confessing to a blue dragon. This is my life now. I am at peace with this. Spica, after due consideration, lay down with her chin on the rocks and gave Miranda an extremely patient look. You are right, Miranda told her. I should soak more and explain less. She soaked. She let the dark water do what dark water did. Above her the sky deepened to its full nightfall, and the stars over the dragon forest were not the stars over Burial. They were more of them, brighter, somehow more her own. The cold thing the music box had put under her sternum had been melted by the water by degrees, and she let it go. She had nothing further she needed to keep. When at last she rose, and Spica nudged her toward the basket and the towel, she was so soft and so warm and so undefended that the walk back through the dusk to the castle felt as though her feet were not entirely connecting with the moss. She was, perhaps, slightly drunk on warmth. Arlo, when he met her at the front door, took one look at her face and shook his head with the resigned grief of a manservant who had seen this coming. "My lady," he said, "you are extremely overheated." "I have," she announced, "been telling secrets to a dragon." "Of course you have, my lady. Of course you have." She came down the stairs in the soft white nightgown Arlo had pressed into her arms. She had meant only to check whether they had returned from their own bath, and, if so, to say good night. She had not meant to overhear anything. The parlor was lit by one lamp. Lucian sat in a long, loose, open-collared shirt on the sofa, his hair down from its tie, drying in dark waves, and Arlo was perched on the arm of an armchair with his small feet tucked neatly under him. They had a sheet of paper between them on the low table. Their voices were low. They had not heard her on the stairs. She paused on the second-to-last step. She did not mean to listen. The room did the listening for her. Since the first king, the forest has held them for 3 centuries, my lord. Every one of them came here because their kingdoms could not hold them. You are not the first. You are simply the most recent. That is not a comfort, Arlo. It is a fact, my lord. You asked for facts. The rain has not stopped in 11 years. The rain has stopped today, my lord, for 3 hours this afternoon, and again now. A small silence. Lucian, in the lamplight, ran a hand back through his damp hair, and his hand was the same hand that had been trembling against her shoulder blades, and his face in profile was tired in a way she had not seen on it before. Tired, the way a person was tired when they had been holding up a roof for a long time and had just remembered it was a roof. I was not the first they sent here. I was only the youngest. The ones before me were all dead by the time I arrived. Yes, my lord. The kingdom that left me here put gold on the doorstep every year for 11 years. They thought it would make up for it. I kept it. I thought, while I was very small, that perhaps if I kept it, it meant they had reconsidered, that I had simply been mislaid by someone who would come back for me. Yes, my lord. They did not come back. No, my lord. Miranda did not move. She did not move for a long time. The moonlight on the parlor floor was a clean, unbroken square of white. She watched it. She thought of her father, who had not come either. She thought of Joseph, who had said her name like a verdict. She thought of an 11-year-old boy alone in a castle full of strangers' apologies, learning what humans did with the children they were afraid of. She came down the last step. They saw her at the same moment. Arlo straightened. Lucian, half rising, had the look of a man whose privacy had been entered without his permission and who did not yet know whether to feel violated or grateful. "I was on the stairs," she said. "I heard." He did not answer. She crossed the room. She did not pretend to busy herself with anything. She came to the sofa and sat down on the cushion beside him, which she had not done before, and laid her hand on the back of his with no preamble at all. "You have been alone," she said, "for 11 years. His hand turned under hers. "Yes." "And the rain until I came did not stop." "Yes." "Lucian," she drew a breath, "I love you." The fire in the lamp guttered. She watched him for the answer. He did not answer in words at once. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the altar, as though he had not been promised her, and yet here she was, and the universe had, in some quiet act of bookkeeping behind his back, given him a thing he had not allowed himself to want. His face moved. For the breadth of an instant it was not the face of a king. It was the face of a child who had just been told that someone was coming back. He hid it. He tried to. The corner of his mouth was the part that gave him away. "You are my rose," he said. No tag. 2 words after the noun. Mine. It did not matter that the words were small. It was the fact of them. It was the way his hand had turned under hers, and the way his thumb had come up to lie across her knuckles, and the way his other hand, after a long-held breath, had reached up and gathered a curl of her hair and brought it to his mouth and pressed his lips against it. A kiss to her hair, not her face, not yet. Her hair, which was the part of her he had told her, on the altar, was beautiful. Her chest did not crack this time. It did the larger thing. It opened. Behind them, faint and unconcerned, came the sound of the front door closing, then the kitchen door, then a voice from the kitchen saying with mild aggravation, "I bought fish. I will be in here. With the fish. Indefinitely." Lucian's mouth, against her hair, twitched. Outside, the moon shone on a courtyard where the rain was not falling and which had not been dry in 11 years. She had hung the white sacrifice dress in the back of the closet that afternoon. She had decided this was the rational thing. Then she had closed the closet door and walked away and gone to bed at a sensible hour. Her body had a different rationality. The dream put her back in the dungeon, stone above, stone below, a bowl of cooling soup beside the cot, untouched. Footsteps coming, the certainty in her stomach that the door was about to open onto a man who had once held her hand and called her clever, and that he would say her name as if reading off a list. She tried to speak. Her throat had closed. She woke with the sound she could not make still trapped behind her teeth. There was a hand against her cheek. "Miranda!" Her chest knew the voice before her eyes did. The lamp on her bedside had been lit. He was sitting on the edge of her bed in the loose, open-collared shirt he had worn to bed himself, his hair down, his face nearer than his face had ever been, and his palm was wide and warm against her wet cheek. "You called out," he said. "I was in the corridor. It was a dream." "I know." She could not loosen her own hands. They had clenched the edge of the blanket, as though the blanket were the door of the cell. Her throat had not opened. She tried to make some polite sound, and the sound did not come. He did not ask her to explain. He moved simply, sat fully onto the edge of the bed, slid his arm behind her shoulders, drew her against him without ceremony or question. He was warmer than the lamp. Her cheek met the linen of his shirt at the place where it had not been buttoned, and the heat of his throat above it was the first thing in the room she could trust. "I will eat your nightmare," he said. She made a small wet noise that was almost a laugh. "You will what?" "There is an animal called a tapir. It eats dreams. Surely the Dragon King can manage what a tapir manages." "That is not how tapirs work." "It is how this Dragon King works," she breathed against his shirt. Once, twice, her throat opened by degrees, the way a fist unclenched when no one needed it to be a fist anymore. After a long time, she told him, stone floor, footsteps, Joseph's mouth saying her name, the dress in the closet. He listened with his hand stroking the back of her head, the way you stroked a child's head, and he answered each piece with a low, even yes. Not agreement, not pity, the sound a man made when he was eating something a piece at a time and did not intend to spit any of it back. When she was finished, she felt drunk and clean. Done, he said. Done? All of it. Eaten. Anything else? She shook her head against his shirt. He pressed his mouth very lightly to her forehead, then settled her back against the pillow, drew the blanket up to her shoulders, and stayed sitting on the edge of the bed. If you have another, he said, call. I am not particular about the hour. She slept. She did not dream. When she woke at first light, he was gone and the lamp was out, and there was a folded clean handkerchief on the table that had not been there before. A week later, Arlo brought her into the parlor with his small, clever face composed and said, I am going to the city tomorrow. I am going to listen to the saint at confession. You are coming with me. Why am I coming? You can see what I cannot. The thing you saw in the music box. That sense. We need it. Lucian in the doorway opened his mouth to object. Lucian closed his mouth again. Lucian had begun in the past week to learn that Arlo had decisions, and that arguing about Arlo's decisions was a poor investment of weather. So Spica took them, invisibly, across 2 kingdoms in a long, quiet evening. They went to ground in a graveyard and slipped into the cathedral by a low side door an hour before vespers. The confessional booth Arlo chose was a small wooden box just wide enough to take 2 narrow shoulders pressed together. She had been raised in palaces. She had never been so close to anyone in her life as she was, at that moment, to a small horned boy crouched in the dark beside her with his hand cupped over her mouth and his breath warmed by the same air as hers. She filed it. She would file it later. She did not move. The lavender of the saint's perfume came in first. Fina knelt on the other side of the screen. Fina's voice, kept low and intimate, began to give a report. She spoke to the priest's grill as though it were a window into a different country, which Miranda came slowly to understand it was. The priest was not a priest. The accent that answered Fina was not Burial, Zavi, the kingdom across Burial's eastern border, the kingdom whose military trains had been growing on the maps for 6 years, the kingdom whose ambassador had stopped attending burial functions. The spring Fina arrived. The conversation was efficient. The bridge collapse was on schedule. The poisoning at the spring festival had failed. Another would be arranged. The girl had been removed, and there had been some brief noise, but the noise had been managed. The crown prince was holding. The military movement could begin within the year if Fina's count of senior officials remained accurate. Miranda heard her own conviction described as managed noise. It landed in her stomach at a depth she had not gone to in weeks. Not grief, not even surprise. The clean, cold, metallic certainty of a thing finally being placed where it had always belonged on the table. Beside her, Arlo's small hand pressed once, briefly, against her wrist, then released. She understood. Stay still. Breathe. Listen. She breathed. She listened. She catalogued. Above the screen, just visible through the carved fretwork, was Fina's bowed head and bowed shoulder and one careful, small folded hand. And over Fina's head, in the place where Miranda had once seen black flames over the crown prince's confessor and not known what they were, hung something now, faint, the color of soot, something her eye, in the past 3 weeks of reading the Dragon Castle for poison, had finally begun to recognize for what it was, She had her power's name now. She had not known she had a power. She had it now. Fina rose. Fina left. Arlo and Miranda waited the half-hour Arlo had decided was prudent. Then Spica, dim as wing shadow in the dusk, took them home. Lucian was at the front gate when they landed. His arms were folded. The set of his jaw was the set of a man who had been preparing a lecture for an hour and a half. He took one look at Miranda's face, and the lecture went out of him. "You heard." "I heard. She is Zavi. The poisonings, the bridge, my conviction, all of it. She works for them." He looked at Arlo. He did not say anything. Arlo looked at the ground in the manner of a person who had successfully avoided a scolding by keeping very still. Then Lucian's hands were on her shoulders, and his head was bent, and his forehead was nearly resting against the top of her hair, and his hands were not gentle. "You will not do that again." "I will probably do that again. Miranda." "There is something I can see, Lucian. You and Arlo cannot see it. I can. You know how that works." He did not answer for a long moment. His hands on her shoulders did not loosen. They did not seem to know they were not loosening. "Yes, my lord," Arlo said politely from the side. "You are still holding the bride." Lucian let go. Arlo, after a careful pause, addressed the gravel. "I have been observing the saint for 6 months. Madame has been here for 3 weeks. We have a confession. I am noting this for the record." "Arlo." "Yes, my lord. Inside, my lord. The plan was war turned into weather. The Empire had massed its parade grounds for a regimental review, banners, polished horses, polished generals. From the hilltop, with Antares, the great red-black fire dragon couched behind them in the long grass, Lucian raised one hand, and the sky stopped being a sky. The cloud came over from the western horizon as if called by name, which it had been. It moved as fast as a horse at canter. It blackened the sun. The grass on the hilltop laid itself flat in 3 long waves of wind, and Miranda's hair pulled out of its pins and went sideways across her face, and the air thickened until breathing it had a taste, and she could feel the hairs along her forearms standing up and her ears popping with the change of pressure. And ahead of them, on the wide cleared parade ground, every horse in 7,000 horses had begun to scream, and every flag had begun to whip and crack, and the men in the long lines of bright uniforms had stopped being lines of bright uniforms and become a sea of small, frightened animals who were starting to run, and above them all, between the storm cloud and the parade ground, Lucian held one open hand at chest height with his palm down, and the storm waited at his palm. He could break a kingdom in the next breath. She knew he could. She had not known until that moment how completely she had known. The first lance of lightning split the sky and earthed itself into the parade ground tower at the far end, and the tower came down in a shower of stone, and Miranda set her hand lightly on his sleeve. "Lucian." He did not look at her. The storm above them made another low rolling sound. The sea of small frightened animals on the parade ground was now crawling and praying and breaking apart at the edges. "They will surrender," she said. "If we ride down now, they will surrender." "They sent her. I know. They put a curse in your music box. They tried to take a kingdom by killing children at festivals. They sentenced you to be eaten. I know that too. I will end them." "Lucian." She did not raise her voice. She kept her hand on his sleeve. The wind tried to pick her up at one point, and she set her shoulder against his side, and the wind let her be. He turned his head. The gold of his eyes was the same gold as the eye of the storm. The thing in his face was not a man's expression. She had felt this before. The night of the music box, the night after the dungeon, the terrible, hot enormity of his protectiveness, set free now, and looking for a horizon to put itself on. "Stop." He did not. "Stop, Lucian. They will surrender. I do not need you to drown them. I need you to come home." The storm held above them, immense and reasonable. The storm released, not into the parade ground, up, outward. The cloud unspooled into long combing strands, and the wind dropped, and the sun came back through the strands of cloud in long pale falling fingers, and on the parade ground below, the sea of small animals slowly stopped being a sea and tried to become an army again, and on the hilltop, above the slowing wind, Lucian closed his open hand into a loose fist at his side. His shoulders were moving with his breath the way a man's shoulders moved at the end of a long run. "They will surrender," he said. "They will. You stopped me." "Yes." He looked at her. He looked for a long time. He had the expression of a man who had just been moved by another person and who was not entirely sure he liked being movable. "I do not trust humans," he said quietly. He had never said this out loud to her. She had known it. He had not said it. "I know. I was 9 when they put me in the iron room. I was 20 when the man who came for me died. I have been in this forest since. I know. I am telling you because you stopped me, because no one has ever asked me to stop a storm, because I would not have stopped it for anyone but you. I know." She did not have anything else to give him in that moment but the words. She did not give him pity. She did not promise to fix it. She gave him the small, flat truth. "I see you. I will not look away. I am going to keep on staying." Her hand was still on his sleeve. She moved her thumb a fraction across the fabric. That was all. The Empire surrendered the next morning. The dress for the revenge ball was the color of the night sky between stars. Black silk shading into deep violet, scattered with crystal beadwork that picked up the candlelight as small, slow constellations across her hips when she walked. Blood-red rubies at her ears. Black silk gloves to the elbow. The dressmaker in Sfale had cut it from the measurements Lucian had taken in the parlor on the night she had touched his horn for the first time, and at the memory of that night, under the assembled chandeliers of the burial court, her hand on his sleeve was steady. He wore the matching tailcoat, same black, same gold thread at the cuffs and collar, blood-red ruby at his throat. The hat that hid his horns came off in the doorway of the throne hall and stayed off, and he walked into the engagement ball of the Crown Prince of Burial with an entire fire dragon visibly couched on the marble behind him, and the assembled court of the kingdom that had once thrown her away made a single small collective noise and fell entirely silent. She had a moment of very pure absurdity. He was wearing a tailcoat. He was the Dragon King. He was wearing a tailcoat with a ruby brooch. He had braided one strand of his hair back at the temple, and his horns gleamed in the candle, and he looked simultaneously magnificent and ridiculous, and she saved that observation for later because there was work to do. The work took 11 minutes, 3 bound men, 3 confessions written down in 3 different hands, the list of stage disasters, the Zavi cipher, Fina's name beside each entry, Joseph on his knees at the foot of his own throne, the parchment shaking in his hand, and Fina, in white silk, the soft, careful saint of prophecy gone gray under her own circlet, a gold pendant of an open eye trembling at her throat. Lucian read 3 lines of the list. He let the parchment drop. He did not look at Joseph. He looked at the back of the room, at the ushers, at the doors. "Take her." The guards moved. They moved because the storm above the palace ceiling had been growing through the entire confession, and a single low rolling thunder had rolled through the throne hall when Lucian had said, "Take her," and Antares, the fire dragon at the far end of the room, had opened its mouth a fraction and shown the small steady flame at the back of its throat. The guards took Fina. Fina did not go quietly. The screaming as they removed her was not language Miranda recognized. Joseph, on his knees, looked up. His mouth moved. He had begun to weep. His mouth shaped Miranda's name and stopped. Lucian set his hand at Miranda's waist and turned her, very slightly, so that her back was to the kneeling crown prince. "My bride," Lucian said to the throne hall, "is not interested in your apologies." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The throne hall heard him at the back wall. "She is the bride your kingdom sent to die. Your kingdom is fortunate that I do not today take payment for that. Your kingdom lives because she does not wish your country erased. You will say her name, and you will say it correctly. Miranda Blackstone, Marquess's daughter, wife of the King of Dragons." He paused. "Do not test me." Then his hand on her waist moved, and the music in her head moved with it. There was no music in the throne hall. The orchestra had stopped on Fina's first scream. And there in the gold-lit silence of the kingdom that had thrown her away, with 700 faces watching, the Dragon King set his hand at Miranda's back, took her gloved hand in his, and waltzed her once around the open floor. No music. None. His chest was where her face nearly was. His eyes, when she looked up, were warm gold without any cool in them. The court, which had been preparing to be afraid of him, was not entirely sure now what it was supposed to be. Several women had begun to cry. A young footman at the side of the room had set down a tray of champagne flutes very carefully on the floor in order to use both hands to hold his face. It was, she conceded later, the best dance of her life. When the waltz ended, he did not bow over her hand. He lifted it to his mouth and kissed the inside of her wrist where the long glove ended, in front of everyone, and then he led her out of the throne hall and onto the front steps where Antares was already lowering his shoulder, and as they rose into the dusk on the back of the fire dragon, the wind took her hair sideways and the candles below grew small. He turned her, on the saddle, facing him, his arm at the small of her back, his other hand under her jaw. "I have decided," he said, "to do this now." She did not have time to ask what. The kiss was deliberate. It was witnessed by Arlo, by Antares, and by the entire city that was about to look up and see two figures backlit on a fire dragon over the palace. It was unashamed. His mouth was warm. Her spine, which had remembered its job in the herb walk and the parlor in the storm, did the job all at once now, and her hands closed in the fine wool of his tailcoat at his collar without instructions from her, and for approximately 4 seconds she did not remember the names of any of her family members. When he pulled back, he looked at her once, gravely, as though confirming something to himself, and then forward again at the night. "My bride." That was all. Below them, the lights of burial grew smaller, and behind them, somewhere, the rain was very gentle on a city that no longer had a saint. She was in a cave with a mineral dragon when he proposed. The dragon's name was Sirius, and he ate gold and excreted gemstones, and Lucian had brought her in to feed Sirius a small ceremonial ingot from the storeroom, and while she was watching the dragon roll the ingot pleasantly under its tongue, Lucian had knelt and produced, from a small box, a ring with a stone the color of a rainbow standing still inside clear glass. "This is yours." "Lucian? I love you." He had been ready, evidently, for various human reactions. He had not been ready for her to laugh, which she did, because the absurdity was perfect, because a mineral dragon was watching with mild curiosity, because she had just been informed she was loved beside a creature whose digestion produced jewelry, and because she had been waiting for the words for a number of weeks without admitting it, and they had arrived the moment her hand smelled like raw gold. She held out her left hand. Her hand was steady. "Yes." The wedding was a small one in the flower field, attended by every dragon in the forest, and presided over by Arlo with such excessive small boy gravity that Miranda nearly laughed twice and forgave herself both times. She wore cream silk. Lucian wore black, with a silver collar pin shaped like a dragon's wing. The vows were short. The dragons roared at the end, and the wildflowers laid themselves flat in 3 concentric circles as though the meadow were applauding. Her ring caught the sun. It threw rainbows across his face. The kiss this time had no audience problem. He kissed her in front of every dragon in the kingdom, and they rumbled as a single, low approving sound. She was a queen now. The pumpkins were going to have to accept this. 2 months later, in early summer, she woke at first light and the castle was empty. No bread smell, no Arlo at the front step, no Spica in the yard. Birdsong. Sunlight. An odd, warm, small lump tucked into the small of her back where Lucian had been sleeping and was no longer. The lump moved. She turned over carefully. The lump turned with her. She lifted the corner of the blanket. A pair of small gold eyes blinked up at her in the early light, set into a pointed, black-scaled face the size of a kitten's. 2 needle points of horn, a long, whip-thin tail, a small chest rising and falling in small, contented breaths. The small black dragon looked at her with the calm of a creature who had decided several decisions ago that this was where he lived now. "Oh," she said. The dragon's name turned out to be Pluto. Lucian and Arlo had spent half the morning dredging a swamp on the suspicion he had drowned in his own eggshell. Pluto had not drowned. Pluto had walked himself across the courtyard, up the staircase, and into the warm middle of the master bed, and had gone back to sleep in the small of Miranda's back, and was now sitting on the corner of her breakfast bread and refusing, with his entire small body, to move. She looked at him. He looked at her. "This bread," she said, "is mine." Pluto chewed a corner of it. "Pluto." Pluto blinked. Slowly. She conceded the bread. She would eat the eggs. He would have the bread. The terms had been set. She was queen now, and the small black dragon was going to have to accept this. Except that, looking at the small black dragon at this hour of the morning, with sunlight coming over his small horns, she found, on consideration, that she was perhaps the one who was going to have to accept some things. The rain over the dragon castle that morning was barely rain. It was the kind of fine, bright drizzle that fell mostly because the air was being polite about humidity. Lucian came in muddy from the swamp. Pluto launched himself out of Miranda's lap and onto Lucian's shoulder and rubbed his small, horned face against Lucian's jaw. Lucian, exhausted, smiled. It was the smile of a man who had everything he wanted in one room. Miranda made a small, careful note of it in the part of herself that did the cataloging and decided that she was, at last, finally and entirely, home. The eastern altar was the same kind of stone as the western altar that had once held her. Miranda noted this and chose not to comment. Arlo, on his knees beside the tribute basket, sorted gold from letters with the practiced quickness of a child who had done this every month of his small life. The basket held 12 small bags of coin, 3 sealed scrolls in burial hand, 2 scrolls in Svala hand, and 1 envelope in a script she had only ever seen on the front of the books in the locked library, an exotic looping border in green and gold ink. She picked it up because it was beautiful. She read it because she had been trained, as a marquess's daughter, in 3 court languages, and Galena was a kingdom adjacent to one of them, to the new and most exalted Dragon King. A harem of 7 women of unsurpassed beauty has been prepared for your pleasure. The crown welcomes you with all anticipations. By the hand of His Majesty of Galena. She read it twice. She read it 3 times. The trees did not change. Arlo did not look up. The dragon Spica, 20 paces off, drank water from a clear stream and did not seem to know. She folded the card. She put it in her pocket. She helped Arlo load the rest of the tribute and did not let the corners of her mouth move at all on the long flight home. "You look like you're thinking about something." "No." "All right, my lady." He did not believe her. He let her have it anyway, which was the polite version of believing her. The dragon castle, when they landed, was warm and bright and smelled of bread. She did not eat the bread. The locked door at the back of the library was the only door in the castle she had not been given a key to. She had been told, when Arlo had pointed it out a month before her wedding, that it was the chamber of the Dragon Kings, that only the king could read what was inside. She had nodded. She had not asked again. She had not asked because she had decided, when she chose to stay, that some doors did not need to open for her on the day she arrived. She had thought there would be more days. She set her hand on the cool gold of the latch. She turned it. It did not turn. She tried again. She tried again with 2 hands. She tried because some part of her that had been sensible for 2 months had given up being sensible at the eastern altar. She set her shoulder against the wood. She set her forehead against the wood. The seal of the Dragon Clan was directly over her face. She did not move for a long moment. There were words for this. None of them were words she let into her mouth. The body did the speaking, the body always did. Her stomach, which had been quiet for a long time, dropped through the floor and stayed there. Her throat closed. Behind her sternum, the door that had cracked on the altar and opened in the parlor swung shut on a slow, careful hinge. It did not slam. She did not let it slam. She stepped back from the locked door. She had been told her whole life that her face looked guilty even when she was innocent. She had been told her eyes were the wrong color. She had been told her mouth was the wrong shape, and her bearing was the wrong bearing, and her temperament was the wrong temperament. She had been told these things by every person who had ever claimed to love her, and she had been disposed of in a night by people who had been told the wrong story. She had decided, at the Dragon Castle, that this was over. The card in her pocket was thin and crisp. It said otherwise. She climbed the library ladder very slowly to the high shelves she had only ever browsed for novels, and pulled down a heavy book on cookery in Eastern court style. She climbed back down. She walked to the kitchen and put the book on the counter, and tied an apron around her waist with the determined motion of a woman who had decided she would earn her keep by becoming useful, because she had not yet been useful, and that was the part that needed mending. She would prove she was worth keeping. She would do it before he came home. She did not know how to start the stove. She had watched Lucian start the stove twice. She had not paid the kind of attention a person paid when she expected to do it herself. She also did not know which of the small jars of spice did what. She did not know, looking at the recipe, what a hand of ginger looked like, or whether the apricots were supposed to be the dried ones or the fresh ones. She did not know how you got water out of a barrel without spilling water on a stone floor. She got water on the stone floor. The pot hit the flagstones once with a sound like a falling church bell, and at the kitchen window a great green dragon face appeared with his great worried liquid eyes and pressed his nose against the glass. "Taurus, it is fine. It is going fine." It was not going fine. The kitchen was, by the time she selected a knife, slightly underwater. The recipe wanted thin slices of red turnip. Red turnips had been provided. They were the size of her 2 fists. She put one on the cutting board and laid her left hand on it to hold it steady. She picked up the largest knife in the block, because the turnip was large and the knife should be large by the symmetry of these things. She brought the knife down. She had forgotten how Dragon Castle knives were sharpened. Her finger gave way a heartbeat before her brain understood that her finger had given way. Then a long red ribbon climbed up the white linen of her sleeve like ivy, and her left palm was wet, and the cutting board was wet, and she was sitting down without remembering having decided to sit, and Taurus was screaming through the glass, and Spica's voice answered from somewhere, and she pressed her good hand around her ruined hand, and her breath came out hard and fast in a way she had not given it permission to. "All right," she said to the kitchen, very quietly, because someone needed to be calm. "All right." She was queen of the dragon forest. She was apparently also incapable of slicing a vegetable. Both of these things were true at once. The cookbook, blameless, sat on the counter with its pretty illustration of paper-thin turnip rounds. She breathed. She did not cry. She had decided, very firmly, that she was not going to cry over a turnip. Eyes burned. She did not blink. The line she was holding was the line. She had said it. She would keep it. A boom of wings. A shadow at the door. Miranda! He was there. Hair half loose from a long flight, coat undone, across the room in 3 long strides and on his knees in the puddle in front of her, eyes scanning her body with the sharp accountant's scan of a man who had once removed every cursed object from a castle in 2 hours. Where? She held up her left hand. He did not waste motion. He took her hand. He looked at her once. Then his mouth closed, gently, around the cut finger, and his eyes closed, and his whole body stilled into the kind of stillness she had felt against him in the parlor on the night she had touched his horn. The thing his tongue did against the wound was not quite a kiss, not quite a press, a warmth she had never felt on her skin before, wet, smooth, alive, that started at the cut and traveled up her wrist and into her shoulder blade and lit her spine in a single long shuddering line that had nothing to do with pain. She made a sound. It was not a word. Her face went hot. He drew her finger out of his mouth. The cut was a thin pink line. As she watched, the line began to fade. You are healed. How? My fluids do that. To dragons. To you. Oh. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He looked at the kitchen in its small, disgraceful state of water and turnip and spilled blood, and at the cookbook open on the counter, and at the knife in the puddle on the floor. Miranda, why? She did not have a sentence ready. She reached into her pocket. She took out the card. She gave it to him. He read it once. He read it twice. The way he read it was the way he had read the curse on the music box. Front and back, edge and seam, professional. Then he folded it. Then he folded it once more. Then he tossed it onto the table in the manner of a man dropping a thing he found uninteresting. I have no use for this. Lucian, I have one bride. I want one bride. There is one bride. The Dragon King takes one. Miranda, this is not a custom that exists. He said it the way he said other simple facts. The way he had said, you are my rose. Without ceremony, without drama, the way of speaking he reserved for things he had stopped considering optional. Her throat opened by a degree. He was not finished. He set both hands on either side of her face and looked at her with the same gold attention he had turned on her at the altar. I do not have other women in another country waiting. I do not have them anywhere. I have spent 11 years alone, and then there was you, and there has not been anyone else, and there will not be anyone else. Do you hear me? Yes. Yes, what? I hear you. He nodded. He kissed her forehead, the same place he had kissed it the night of the nightmare. The kiss was clean and brief and certain. She believed him. Her chest, which had pulled the small, careful door closed in the library, set its hand on the latch. She did not push it open yet. There was one more question. Lucian, why have you not told me about the dragon wedding? His hands, on her face, paused. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Taurus and Scorpio crowded the window and said nothing. Pluto, who had appeared at some point on the spice shelf and eaten an apricot, finished his apricot. The afternoon sun crossed a flagstone and then crossed the next flagstone. There are things, Lucian said slowly, I have not yet shown you. What things? Things I will. Soon. Lucian. I will. I promise. His eyes did not lie. They also did not say. He had become, on the question of the dragon wedding, a man with a paper that he was holding face down on a table, and the not showing her of it was the entire problem. She looked at him for a long moment. The eyes burn climbed half an inch and held there. She did not cry. "All right." That was all. 2 words. No tag. He pressed his forehead briefly against hers and let her go. The cut on her finger was already gone. The kitchen was still in disarray. The cookbook lay open at the wrong recipe. Pluto licked a small, careful corner of an apricot and watched both of them with the unblinking patience of a small creature who understood that something had happened and was filing it. She let Lucian carry her, after a moment, into the parlor. She let him set her on the sofa and bring her tea and put a blanket over her knees the way he had on the first morning. She drank the tea. She thanked him for it. The rain over the castle that evening was steady, not heavy, not soft. The rain of a man whose mind was somewhere else. Miranda sat on the sofa in the dark for a long time after Lucian had gone up to bed and Arlo had gone up to bed, with a small black dragon asleep in the curve of her arm and the harem invitation lying folded on the table where Lucian had left it as if it had never mattered, and stared at the closed door of the library on the far side of the hall. Her finger was unmarked. Her chest was not. She filed it. He came to her on the morning after the kitchen, and he had a key in his hand. He did not say anything for a moment. He turned the key over in his palm. He had been carrying it, she understood, since he had met her on the altar. She had not known the shape of it. She knew it now. "I should have shown you this sooner," he said. "Yes. I will not say I am sorry. I will say that I will not do it again." Yes. He took her down the long corridor to the library, and through the library, to the little gold-locked door at the back of it, and the lock turned smoothly under his hand because the lock had been made for that hand, and only that hand. The room beyond was a long, narrow chamber, lined with books to the ceiling on both sides, and on a polished cedar table at the far end lay one large open ledger, the bookmark of which was a thin black ribbon, and on the open page of which was the long, careful inked script of every dragon king who had stood here before him. Pluto walked between her ankles and sat on her foot. She read for a long time. The pages told her what the dragon wedding was. The pages told her what fated mate meant. They told her that the bond was not a custom. The bond was a fact. There was one. There had only ever been one. The previous dragon kings had each had one and only one, and when the bond did not arrive in their lifetime, they had remained alone, and the rain had fallen on this castle for years on end. The pages told her, in the clean, dry cadence of an old book, that the Dragon King's mate was decided by the marriage of his blood and hers in a ceremony for which Pluto was the witness, and after which she would no longer age, and after which he would no longer be alone. She read it twice. She set her hand flat on the page over the entry written in Lucian's own hand, where he had recorded, 4 months ago, in steady ink, "Found her, Eastern altar, sent by burial as sacrifice, Miranda Blackston. The forest understood before I did, so there was no one else. There had never been anyone else. There could not have been. Her chest did the slow, complete thing it had not yet done in this story. The door that had cracked on the altar opened in the parlor, half shut after the Galena letter. The door opened. Lucian stood at her shoulder. He did not speak. He had given her the room. She closed the ledger gently. She turned. She set her forehead lightly against the front of his shirt. He bent his head. He kissed the crown of her hair where the ledger had said his lips would always know to. "All right," she said. It was the same 2 words she had given him in the kitchen. They meant something different now. A week later, sailing south to Galena because the Galena king had sent 4 letters, and Lucian had decided, with Miranda, that politeness was the cheaper option than another storm, she woke in the cabin alone and went to find him on deck. He was at the windward rail with his coat open and his hair pulled back in a loose tie. The lantern at the helm gave him a small yellow edge. He turned when he felt her come up beside him and did not pretend he had been doing anything but waiting to be found. You should be sleeping. So should you." He looked back out to sea. The moon was on the water in a long, slow, restless line. He drew her into his coat the way a man drew a small bird out of weather, and she fitted there under the cloak with her temple at his shoulder, and for a long time the only sounds were rope and water. "Earlier today," he said, "I saw a man on the lower deck I knew when I was 9 years old." She did not move. "He looked older. He was always older than me. He worked for the Chancellor of Ukres. He was one of the men who came down to the iron room with the bowl." She had questions. She did not ask them. He did not look at her while he talked. The dark made it easier. He told her in short, flat installments. The kingdom of Ukres had decided, when the dragon blood showed in the firstborn prince, that he was a thing rather than a child. He had been moved out of the nursery at 6 years old. He had been moved into the iron rooms of the lower palace at 9. He had been kept there, and the chancellor's men had come down with bowls and small clean knives, because Lucian's blood, like the rest of his fluids, healed wounds, and the old men of the council, in the evenings, found this to be a useful tonic. His voice broke on the word bowl. He stopped. He breathed once. He started again. They took, on average, the bowl every 3rd week. By the time the previous Dragon King's people came for me, I was 20. He did not survive the journey to bring me here. Ares carried the body. The rain has not stopped from that day until you came. She did not speak. She did not say, "I am sorry." She did not say that should not have happened to a child. She did not say any of the things her chest was making her want to say. She set her hand, palm flat, against the inside of his coat over his ribs where the body kept its old wounds, and she pressed lightly, and she stayed there. The wind moved in the sail above them. "I have not told this to anyone," he said. "I know. I am telling you because the man on the lower deck, I have not been certain since I saw him whether I would, when we landed, set the harbor on fire. I have not yet decided. I am telling you so that if I do, you understand why." "You will not." "How do you know?" "Because I am asking you not to. Because you stopped the storm at the parade ground. Because you are not a thing. You have never been a thing. They were the things, and they are mostly dead, and the ones still alive are 10 years from any harm they can do you. We will look. If he is here, we will know it. We will not burn a harbor to find out." He breathed out. Long. Slow. The kind of breath a man took when he had been holding it for 11 years and had been given permission to stop. All right. She would remember this. All of it. The wind, the lantern, the salt, the old wood of the rail under her hand, and the small, wet, warm shape against the side of her face that was her own tears at last, finding the route they had not been allowed in the kitchen, and the bigger, harder, older breath against her hair that she could only hear because she was inside the coat. She wept quietly there for a quarter-hour, eyes burning, voice cracking once when she said his name. He did not say anything. He only kept her inside the coat. When she was finished, he kissed the top of her head. "You will not be alone again," she said, against his shirt. "All right." That was the deepest place in the story. It would not get deeper than that. They would only get nearer to it. Galena had been theatrical about everything since they docked. The dock had been theatrical, a row of beautiful young women in loose silks and gold cuffs, holding garlands. Miranda had not waited for protocol. She had stepped to the front of Lucian's party, looked at the eldest of the silk women, and said, in clear Galena, "I am the Dragon Queen. He has the one bride." The garlands had been lowered. Lucian, behind her, had bitten the inside of his cheek to keep his face composed. Arlo, in his small notebook, had written one word and underlined it. The audience with the king had been theatrical. A long carved hall, a procession of 7 beautiful women presented one by one with their lineages, and at the end, the king's gentle suggestion that any or all of them would, of course, be welcome to the dragon castle. Lucian had not let the king finish. "I have a bride." That was all. 3 words. The gold rings on the king's hands had stilled. The 7 women had dispersed with very straight backs. It had been theatrical, and Miranda had handled it. She had not minded any of it. She had been confident in it. The library in the Dragon Castle had been the work. This was the assembly line. The drink at dinner was something else. She had not taken any. Lucian had taken 1 ceremonial cup because the king had pressed it on him. The king had smiled in a way the king should not have smiled. By the time they had retired to the carved bedchamber, with its gauzy canopy and its incense smoke and its very obvious arrangement, Lucian had been quiet for 40 minutes, and his hand had been hot against the small of her back. She turned to him. He had a hand pressed against his mouth, and his eyes closed. "Lucian." There was a tonic in the cup. The body absorbed it. I did not know it was... The wind began outside. It came from nothing. It was not weather she had seen before in him. It rose across the palace gardens in a soft, long-drawn line that grew and pulled at the carved screens and shook the gauzy canopy, and her hair lifted slightly from her shoulders even inside the room. He was not looking at her. He had taken hold of the carved bedpost in one hand, and his knuckles were white. "Wait," she said. She put her palm against his chest. She felt his heart under it like a hand pressed against a closed door. "Wait. Stop trying to stop the wind. Look at me." He looked at her. The gold of his eyes was hot. His mouth was. He was. The man who had stopped a kingdom-killing storm was failing at his own pulse, and he was failing because he had decided, the moment the king's drink had hit him, that whatever happened next was not going to happen tonight, and the holding of that decision was costing him the wind. He kissed her. It was nothing like the kiss on Dragonback. The kiss on Dragonback had been a flag planted in front of a court. This was the kiss of a man who had been alone in a castle for 11 years and who had been waiting for one specific person and who was, in this exact moment, neither alone nor cold nor patient. His mouth was hot. His hand was at her jaw and then in her hair and then at her waist, and her back was against the bed, and the world had become the line of his body against hers, and her spine was singing, and her hands had closed in his hair without instructions, and the wind outside had become a long, howling thing that was rattling the carved screens, and the canopy was billowing like a sail, and the lamps were guttering, and her own breath was not her own breath anymore, and his teeth were against the line of her throat, and... He broke off. He pushed himself up, both hands on the bed on either side of her shoulders. His eyes were closed. His face was turned away. His breath came hard. Not like this. She lay there. She breathed. Her hands let go of his hair very slowly because they were not going to be the part of her that would not let go. Not because that vain old fox put a tonic in a cup. When this happens, it will be because I chose it and because you chose it, not because his drink decided it for us. Yes, Miranda, I know. He sat up. He kept himself on the edge of the bed. He picked up the pillow. He looked at the pillow as though the pillow had wronged him personally. Then he stood, bowed shortly to her in the lamplight as though they had just finished a game of chess, and said, "I am sleeping in the sitting room. The wind will stop." "All right." The wind stopped at the door. She lay alone in the carved bed under the gauzy canopy, with the incense thinning around her and her body on fire, and her dignity intact, and the rain that had not been rain starting now, polite, soft, sad. She put the back of her wrist against her forehead. She rolled herself in the silk sheets. "He is the most maddening human being," she said to the ceiling. The ceiling, which had been carved with the legend of a dragon and a moon and a king who had loved them both, did not disagree. Cass's malice had been dim until the market. He had been their guide for 2 days, soft-spoken, polite, very young, dressed in the loose galena tunics with his hair tied back. She had walked behind him through the spice market with Arlo half a step behind her, and then she had seen, above his shoulder, the small, dim soot shadow of conflicted intent that her library studies had taught her to read. Not malice, not exactly. Loyalty, debt, indoctrination, the smaller, sadder sister of malice. Black flames that did not entirely belong to the wearer. She had opened her mouth to call to Arlo. She had not been fast enough. A kerchief had come up over her face from behind. The world had narrowed to that cloth, and then, by degrees, to nothing. When she had come back to herself, she had been in a bouncing carriage with a hood pulled off her head, her hands tied behind her, and Cass beside her, no longer in the high silver voice of the maid, but in his own, apologizing, as though apologies were a currency that worked on this side of an abduction. "I am very sorry, my lady. The road is rough. You were our guide." "Yes." "You were going to do this." "Yes." She did not bother with anger. Anger would not move the carriage. Cataloguing would. She catalogued. Two men opposite, black scarves, soot flame above their heads, dense enough to be useful information. They would hurt her if it served their purpose. Cass's flame was thinner. Cass would not. Cass had decided, somewhere, that he did not want to. A goat path, a long climb. The carriage gave way to walking. The walking gave way to a cliff-top plateau the color of old blood, with red rock walls on 3 sides and a sheer fall on the 4th, and a great pit in the center of the plateau in which something the size of a barn had been excavated out of the stone. A sleeping black dragon, scales matted with rock dust, the clothesline of its eye longer than her arm. "This is our god," Cass said. She did not look at him. The men of Seth's group placed themselves around her in a loose half-circle, the way men place themselves around bait. Miranda noted this with the same dry administrative calm she had given the pumpkins on the altar. She noted that her hands were tied. She noted that the back of her ankle had been chafed by the rope on the climb. She noted that the air, which had been bright over Galena, had begun to lower over the plateau, and that the wind had begun to move in long preparatory tugs against her hair, and that the violet bruise on the sky overhead was the very specific color of the sky over a man who knew where his wife was and had not stopped flying. A hand came up beside her. A blade lay flat against her throat. Seth, the one Cass had called Sita, stepped close enough that she could smell the sour incense in his beard. "Be still, my lady. The Dragon King is coming for you. I would not have him distracted by a small accident with a knife." She was still. She was very still. She had been on a stone altar under the same sky once, with rope at her wrists and pumpkins around her, and she had decided then she would not scream, and the decision had cost her nothing that day, and the decision cost her nothing now. Her stomach was ice. Her hands were folded in her lap inside the rope. Her throat, which had tightened on the deck of the ship, did not tighten now. She was past tightening. Eyes burned. She did not blink. Behind her, far in the violet sky, the air made a small, low rolling sound that was not yet thunder. She knew that sound. She was waiting for Lucian. He would come. She knew this the way she had known the altar had been the beginning of the rest of her life. It would be him next. It would be him in the next minute, or the minute after that. Until then, she was a woman with a rope at her wrists, waiting under a knife with very good posture. The sky above the cliff bruised darker. The first rumble reached the rock under her feet. She closed her eyes for one slow, even breath and opened them again, and then she stood, very calmly, in front of the altar she had come to of her own volition this time, and waited for the Dragon King. He came over the ridge alone. He came on a mountain goat, of all things, because the path had been too narrow for a dragon, and the goat was the animal that knew the way, and he came down the long slope in the long black coat, with his hair pulled back at the nape and his face set, and the sky behind him was the color of a bruise the body had stopped trying to hide. The men around her noticed him a heartbeat before she did. He was not hurrying. He was not rushing. He was crossing a distance he had decided to cross. The wind in front of him moved. She did not call his name out loud. Her chest did. Her chest did the work her mouth could not. He came down off the goat at the edge of the plateau and let it walk away. He looked at the men. He looked at the knife. He looked at her. The knife at her throat did not lower. Seth, behind it, drew himself up. "Dragon King." "Move that. You will fill this pot," Seth said, and gestured to a clay urn the size of a wash basin sat on the rock between them, "with your blood. The dragon will wake. The kingdom will return. Then we will let her go." Lucian looked at the pot. He looked at the great black-scaled bulk in the central pit, half excavated, the closed line of an enormous eye. He walked to it slowly. He set his hand against the dust-matted scales. His hand stayed there for a moment. He took it away. "That is not a dragon. It is the guardian. That is the shed skin of Antares. He shed in this country approximately 40 years ago. The skin is empty. It has always been empty. It has been empty since Antares had it on his back. There is no dragon to wake. There never was a dragon to wake. You have been kneeling for 10 years to a snake's old shirt." The plateau had gone very still. The men of Seth's group looked at each other. Cass, half a pace behind Seth, had the face of a young man whose entire understanding of his life was being unhooked from its pegs. Seth did not move. Seth's mouth opened on a breath that had nowhere to go. "You are lying. I have eaten dinner with Antares for 16 years. He is, presently as I understand it, on his way here. You can ask him about his shed skin yourself. You are lying." "I am not." "You will fill the pot." "No." The knife pressed. Miranda's throat was the only thing in her body that registered that. The metal was cold. The knife was a working knife, not a ceremonial one. The man holding it had hands that shook slightly, which she noted because the shaking would matter if he slipped. She did not move. She kept her chin very slightly lifted so that the line of pressure on her throat stayed where the knife wanted it. She had been on a stone altar with rope at her wrists and pumpkins around her, and she had decided then she would not scream, and the decision had cost her nothing, and the decision cost her nothing now. Lucian was looking at her. The gold of his eyes was very quiet. "Dragon King," Seth said, and his voice rose, and his voice rose because his certainty was being taken from him in real time, and he had built his life on it. "You will fill the pot. Or—" "Take her knife away from her throat," Lucian said very softly, "and we will discuss what I will and will not do. You will fill—" The knife came up, not far, a handspan, a man's last attempt to enforce a thing the world was no longer agreeing to enforce. He drew his arm back to slap her with the flat of the blade as a demonstration of the way Miranda's tutor had drawn his arm back over her knuckles at 6 years old, and she watched the metal arc, and she did not move, and her stomach was ice, and her throat was cold, and she was not afraid. She was only in the small, pure quiet that follows fear, and the blade came down toward her face. And stopped against a sword scabbard that had appeared in the air between her cheek and the metal. A very small voice spoke from somewhere underneath her elbow. "You will not strike, madam." Arlo had gone visible. He had been there the whole time. He had been there since Lucian's foot had touched the goat's saddle. He had been positioned, invisible, at her left side for every breath she had taken on this plateau. And now he had a market-bought sword in its sheath, jammed lengthwise between her face and a knife, and he was 8 years old, and he was terrifying. Seth went back a step. That was the moment Lucian moved. What he did was not visible. Miranda saw the air move. She saw Seth's right wrist twist, and she saw the knife in the hand holding it leave Seth's body, and she saw Seth go to his knees with a sound that was not a word. the knife and the hand holding it, were simply gone. Behind Lucian, the sky split, white, then white, then white. 3 lances of lightning struck the plateau in a triangle around the men of Seth's group, and the men went to the ground and stayed there, and the rock under Miranda's feet hummed. The wind that had been moving in front of Lucian moved past him now and sucked the loose silk from her sleeves outward, and the air smelled the way it smelled inside a forge. Cass moved? Cass moved because Cass had been Seth's project for 10 years and had been raised by Seth and had been told what to feel about Seth, and Cass moved between Seth and a second windstrike Lucian had not yet finished aiming, and the air took Cass across the chest and the shoulder in a long, clean, wide cut, and Cass folded over himself and did not get up. "Cass," Miranda said. She had not meant to. Her voice came thin. Lucian looked at the boy on the ground. The set of his mouth changed. That one was not for him. "I know." He moved toward Cass. Then, because the universe was not done, Seth, on his knees on the bloodied rock with a stump where his hand had been, used his good left hand to draw from inside his black robe the small ugly thing he had been carrying for this exact moment. A pistol. Arlo saw it first. "Gun." The sound the pistol made was not loud. It was a small, dry, sharp thing. Miranda saw the muzzle flash. She saw the small puff of smoke. She saw the line of the bullet's path in the way the air moved, because everything had become slow and detailed and very, very clear. And she saw, very clearly, the small black dragon that came out of the inside of Arlo's pack at the same moment. He had not been allowed on the trip. He had stowed away. He had stowed away on every trip they had taken since he had hatched. He came out of the pack the way a bee came out of a hive. He moved fast. He moved faster than the bullet should have allowed him to move, and he did not move toward Miranda, and he did not move toward Arlo. He moved to put the small kitten-sized line of his body between Lucian's chest and the bullet, and he was small enough, and the bullet was small enough, and the bullet went into him just under his small heart, and the small black dragon went sideways in the air with his wings half open and hit the rock about 5 feet from her with a soft sound that Miranda would hear, in the way one hears certain sounds, for the rest of her life. She was on her knees before her brain understood. She had moved. He was small. He was so small. He was warm, and he was getting cooler, and there was a small, wet, dark place under his ribs, and his small pink tongue had come out from between his teeth, and he was looking at nothing. The eye she had known the gold of for 2 months was no longer the same gold. She picked him up, and he did not weigh anything. He did not weigh anything at all. "Pluto." She said his name. Once. Quiet. She had been a marquess's daughter. She had been on an altar. She had been bound on a cliff. She had not, at any of those times, made the sound that came out of her now, and that sound was not loud either, and was simply the cracked open one-syllable noise of no. Lucian was beside her. He was on his knees in the rock dust. His face had no expression. He took Pluto out of her hands gently, not because he was taking him from her, but because he was preparing to do something. Then he held his own left wrist over Pluto's small chest and ran the edge of his right hand along the inside of his own forearm in one quick, clean movement, and his blood, bright red, immediate, fell across the small black scales of a small black body, fell into the small wet dark place under the ribs, fell across the small pink tongue, fell warm and unhurried and complete onto the small black wings that were half open and not moving, and as it fell, layer on layer, drop on drop, the rock dust under the dragon went dark, and the small wet dark place under the ribs began to close from the inside out the way water closed when you stopped pressing on it, and the small pink tongue moved an inch back into his small black mouth, and the small chest, which had been still, made one small breath, and then another small breath, and the gold eye that had been looking at nothing came back, by degrees, to the gold of the gold she had known, and looked up at Lucian, who was bleeding from both palms and from the inside of one forearm, and was now several shades paler than a man Miranda was prepared to leave kneeling on a cliff, and Pluto, in his very small voice that had once eaten her breakfast, said one small word. Miranda put her hands over her mouth. Then her chest, which had been holding for 2 months, did the larger thing it had been refusing to do. It opened. Tears went down her face. They were not the burning eyes of the kitchen, not the wet quiet of the shipcoat. They were the third stage. They tracked down. They did not stop. Her breath came in a long, hard hitch, and then in another, and her shoulders went, and she was on her knees on red rock at the edge of a cliff, with a small black dragon breathing in front of her and a man bleeding on the rock beside her, and the body she had been managing for the entire story stopped being managed. Lucian set Pluto against her chest. He did this carefully because his hands were not entirely steady. Then he sat back on his heels in front of her and looked at her, and his eyes did the thing they had not done before. The gold did not cool. The gold did not hide. The gold was fully open the way her chest was fully open, and his mouth moved without armor. "Miranda, I know. You were never a sacrifice. You were always coming home." He said it without a tag. He said it without the careful Dragon King vowels. He said it the way a man said something he had been holding behind his teeth from the moment he found her tied on a stone altar with vegetables around her, and he said it raw, and he said it the way the previous Dragon King had probably said, "You are safe now," to a child in a ballroom. He said it once. She could not answer him in words. She had been a sacrifice. She had been a sacrifice, and she had come home. The kingdom had thrown her away, and the road they had thrown her down had been the road. She was not a wrong thing put in the right place. She had not been mislaid. She was where she was supposed to be, and she had been on her way here from the beginning. The catharsis line broke open all of it. The dungeon, the soldiers walking faster than they should have walked, the carriage, the stone, the pumpkins, the dragon stomping into the brush, the man with the knife, the man with the bowl, the man who had woven a story to dispose of her, broke open all of it into one single recognition. The road had been the road. She nodded. She could not speak. She sobbed once, hard, against his neck. Then she stopped. The body that had been managing for 2 months had reset. The crying did not become anything more. She had earned it, and she had taken it, and she had come back to herself on the other side of it. Lucian put his arms around her. Pluto was warm against her sternum. The plateau was silent. It rained, soft, gentle, the kind of rain that did not threaten anything, that had simply decided to fall and was following through. She came up off the ground a few minutes later because her hand had remembered Cass. He was on the rock, about 6 paces away, with his eyes closed, a thin, wet red line drawn from his collarbone to the bottom of his ribs. The black scarf had come off in the fall. His face was not the face of an enemy. It was the face of a 16-year-old boy who had been raised by the wrong man and had decided, at the very last moment, to be a different person. Lucian followed her gaze. He looked at Cass. "This one," he said quietly. "Reachable?" Arlo, beside Cass, with 2 fingers at the boy's throat, said, "Yes." Lucian sighed once, then knelt, then bled across Cass the way he had bled across Pluto. The wound on Cass closed in long, slow, steady folds. Cass's breath, which had been shallow, deepened. His eyes, when they opened, were not the eyes of a follower anymore. They were the eyes of a boy who had just been lifted out of the only story that had ever been his and was looking for the first time at the world. He looked at Lucian. He looked at the closed line on his own chest. He looked at Lucian again. His mouth moved. "You are real. Yes, you have always been the real one. Yes, Cass, on his back on the rock, began to weep in the unrehearsed shaking way of a boy who had not been allowed to cry in his life. Lucian put a hand on his shoulder for the count of 3 breaths and then took it away. He stood. He swayed. Arlo caught his elbow. "My lord, I am fine." "You are very, very far from fine, my lord." "Arlo, yes, I am, I think, going to sit down." He sat. He sat on a flat slab of red rock at the edge of the pit. Miranda came to him with Pluto in her arms and curled herself in against him the way a person fits a cup against a saucer, and his arm came around her, and Arlo, who had taken many notes in the past 4 months, and who did not seem inclined to take any now, simply opened a small leather field kit he had been carrying for most of his short life. On the off chance that it would, eventually, be needed for exactly this, and began wrapping the inside of Lucian's left forearm with the practiced quickness of a child who had been a foundling in a castle for as long as he could remember. Seth, on the rock 15 paces away, was conscious. He was not going to be a problem. He had stopped being a problem at the moment Lucian had identified the shed skin as a shed skin. He had crawled to the base of the rock and was sitting against it with his stump in his lap, and he was looking at nothing. Some men, Lucian had said once, did not survive being told that the story they had built their lives on was wrong. Seth was one of them. The kingdom of Galena would deal with him. The rain came down on red rock. The rain hit Pluto's small black scales in small, clean silver beads. The rain hit Lucian's eyelashes and stayed there. "Lucian," Miranda said, I need you to stay alive. I need you to bleed less. I am working on it. I am asking you to work on it harder." He smiled. It was a tired smile. It was a small one, and it was the only one of his she had ever seen that was not arranged for an audience, and it was for her. "Yes, my lady." Pluto, who had been very still inside her arms, lifted his small black head and looked at the gentle rain, and put out his small pink tongue and tasted it, and then settled, with the calm of a small creature who had decided long ago that this was where he lived now, against her chest. Above them, at the very far end of the plateau, came the great rolling beat of enormous wings. Antares had arrived to bring them home. The Galena king apologized for an hour and a quarter. Miranda thought, listening, that an hour and a quarter was perhaps a little long, but the king's hands were genuinely shaking, and his ministers had the carefully composed faces of men who had recently been informed they had nearly given the Dragon King a reason to dissolve the country, and so she let him say everything he needed to say. When he was finished, she asked one thing. "Cass." The king's eyes flicked to the boy at the side of the hall. Cass stood in plain clothes with no scarf, his dark hair combed back, the long, thin scar from his collarbone to his ribs hidden beneath his shirt now, and not entirely hidden in his face. He kept his eyes on the floor. He had been waiting for the verdict the law required, which was a heavy one. He was raised into the thing he did, Miranda said quietly. He was a child. He was given a story. He chose to step out of it at the cost of his own body. I am asking the crown to be lenient. The ministers looked at the king. The king looked at his ministers. There was a great deal of careful diplomatic regret about how the law on this point was, in fact, the law. Lucian, on the bench beside her, leaned back. "I have lost interest in your laws." The hall went still. "Cass deceived me. Cass abducted my bride. The punishment for that is mine to set." The king nodded so quickly, his small gold crown shifted forward on his brow. "First, the crown of Galena will be responsible for his rehabilitation. Second, he will serve, henceforth, as our official translator on every visit the Dragon Clan makes to this country. Whenever I come, Cass comes. Whenever Miranda comes, Cass comes. He will be paid a fair wage and treated as the most important member of the foreign service, and if any harm comes to him, I will be told before the door closes behind the one who harmed him. A pause. That is the punishment. The king's mouth opened. The king's mouth closed. The ministers performed an interesting, subtle calculation in real time and then began to smile because what Lucian had just said was, in addition to everything else, a promise that the Dragon King would visit the kingdom of Galena, which had been the entire goal of Galena foreign policy for 40 years. Cass, on the side of the hall, lifted his head. He did not say anything. His mouth shaped a word. It might have been thank you. It might have been yes. Lucian inclined his head an inch, and that was the only acknowledgement necessary. Arlo, from his small chair behind Miranda, said very softly, "That is the most pragmatic act of mercy I have witnessed." He had, Miranda noted, already drafted the diplomatic framework. He passed it to the king's clerk on the way out. She fell asleep at last in a great soft galena bed with Lucian's arm around her waist and Pluto's small warm shape tucked into the curve of her elbow, and she dreamed. She dreamed white. She dreamed of standing in an open place that had no edges. She dreamed knowing she was dreaming and finding it unusual. Then a presence resolved in front of her, large, glowing, the shape and color of a small black dragon she had carried home from a cliff, but bigger, taller than her, the size of a full-grown horse, his scales luminous and his great gold eyes gentle. Pluto. The voice was the same voice. It was only the body that had grown. She stepped toward him, smiling, and a smaller figure stepped out from the screen of his shoulder. A boy, 14, 15 at most, slim and thin-boned and pale with deep blue hair to his shoulders and small smooth horns and golden eyes she would have known on any face in any country in any century. Lucian. His ears went pink. He had the same ears. "This is the Dragon King's wedding," he said. "The mate ceremony. Pluto is the witness. I came as I was, when I was old enough to know what I am asking and not yet old enough to ask it without your permission." "I see." "Pluto offers you, if you accept, a life that is the same length as mine. I do not know how long that is. It will likely be a very long time. I am not asking you to do this. I am only asking if you wish to be asked." She did not need the second question. "I accept." "Miranda, wait. I have been accepting this since the altar. I am only saying the version that is meant to last." The boy with Lucian's eyes blinked at her. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. The grown adult man she had married would have controlled his face. The boy did not. The boy looked, for one bright second, like a child who had just been told someone was coming back. Pluto bent his great luminous head toward her chest. He opened his great gentle mouth, and from inside came a small, round, soft, warm light the size of a child's palm. The light moved out of his mouth and into the air between them, and then into her, through the front of her dress, into the place behind her sternum, into the chest that had cracked on the altar and opened in the parlor and shut and reopened and finally and entirely opened on a cliff. It settled there. The warmth did not pass. It stayed. It put down its small, careful roots inside her and moved into every place in her body that had ever been cold, and where it touched, it stayed, and the cold did not come back. She closed her eyes. The boy's voice, very small, very specific, very young. "I love you. Thank you for staying." And then the white dream space went brighter than she could see and dissolved. She opened her eyes onto pale rose dawn. The room was warm. The light was warm. Her chest was warm. The body she had wakened in for 20 years had a new quality to it she did not have a word for and did not need a word for. A soft, round, soft, warm light at the back of her sternum that her body had decided to accept as part of itself. Lucian's eyes were already open. He had been watching her sleep, which she pretended not to notice, and then, after consideration, decided to notice. The deep blue of his hair on the white pillow was the deep blue of the night sky between stars, and his gold eyes had no cool in them at all this morning, and his small black horns lay against the pillow as though they had been carved there. "You have been awake," she said, "for some time. Did you also dream?" "Yes." "Were you also a child in it?" Briefly. She smiled. She had not seen what 14-year-old Lucian had thought about the situation when she had said yes, and she did not need to. The small black horns on the pillow and the gold eyes were the answer. "You did not warn me?" "I had been warned myself only the night before." "By whom?" "By Pluto, I think. He communicates by—" "I do not know." "By proximity. I dreamed it the night before the cliff. He showed me you saying yes. I did not dare to want it for that reason." She lifted her hand. She set her palm flat against his cheek. He turned his face into it. "I would have said yes the first morning," she said, "if you had asked me over the omelette. You had only known me 12 hours. The chest knows." He kissed her then, slow and clean and certain, the way a man kissed a woman who had agreed to share his lifespan in a dream space ceremony witnessed by a small revived dragon god, the way a man kissed his wife. They had the quiet morning. They had time. The small black dragon at the foot of the bed turned over once in his sleep and settled again, and outside, far below the carved stone window of the Galena guest chamber, in the air over the country, whose king had spent an hour and a quarter apologizing, no rain was falling at all. The morning held itself perfectly still around them and asked them no questions. She had time now, all of it. The patrol of the dragon forest was the slow, happy work of an afternoon. She rode in front of Lucian on Scorpio's broad red back, his arm at her waist out of habit now and not necessity, and they crossed the wide green hills of his country in long, unhurried sweeps. They greeted the old serpent in the cliff cave. They landed on a marsh edge to feed the fat green water dragons who lived in the reeds and complained about the weather. They visited 2 enormous brothers at the door of a deep cave who, after sniffing Miranda's hair, lowered their large, terrifying heads one by one to be petted, which was a development Lucian had not expected and which Miranda accepted with the particular dignity of a woman who had decided that being a dragon queen meant patting whatever scheduled itself to be patted. "They have not done that for me in a decade," Lucian said. "They have a refined sensibility. They are extorting you for vegetable scraps. That is a refined sensibility." They came at last to a hill she had not seen before, where small, slim white dragons, no bigger than terriers, floated in the air the way small fish moved in clear water, and the dragons came down to her, and one stayed on her shoulder, and one settled in the bowl of her hand. She laughed. It was a clean laugh, an unguarded one, the laugh of a woman who had nowhere she needed to be. Pluto, the size of a kitten, the size of a king, came down out of the sky and lit on Lucian's shoulder. He was acting as the official judge of a foot race 2 of the small dragons had organized between themselves and which Pluto had no authority over. He was implementing it anyway. He had appointed himself. "Pluto, you are not the judge. You are not." Pluto, ruled against, ate the prize sandwich. They sat on the picnic blanket on the hill in the soft middle of an afternoon. The sandwiches were excellent. The smaller of them had Galena spice in it. Lucian had bought the spice on the trip and was using it in the bread now, and the morning sandwich and the afternoon sandwich were 2 countries' worth of bread held in the same simple white napkin. He had decided to learn this. He had decided to learn many things in the past 2 months. "I cannot slice a turnip," Miranda said, around a bite. "You will," he said. "I had a great deal to prove to a cookbook last summer, and I lost." "You will," he said again. He passed her another piece. "There is time." She finished the sandwich. She lay back on the blanket. The clouds were the kind of clouds that did nothing. The sky was the kind of sky that asked nothing. She folded her hands over the a soft, round, warm light at the back of her sternum that had been there since Galena, and that did not require any further notice from her, and she closed her eyes for the length of 3 breaths. When she opened them, Lucian was looking at the cliff at the end of the hill where a small white tombstone stood in the high sun. "I want to go up there," he said. "I want to introduce you." She gathered the wildflowers without asking what for. Scorpio set them down on the cliff path and waited at the edge with his great red bulk like a parked carriage. The cliff faced south over the entire dragon forest. The forest below was the green of a place left alone for a long time. Wind moved through the long grass. Small white wildflowers came up between her ankles. At the high lip of the cliff, set in clean dressed white stone, was a single tombstone. The name on it was carved in deep clean letters. Gerald Dragonia. Here lies the King of Dragons. She knelt. She set her bouquet at the foot of the stone. Lucian set down beside it a small clay flask of sake, a small clay cup, and a single hand-rolled cigar that he lit with one small, precise crackle of the air at his fingertip. He poured a measure into the cup. He did not pour for himself. He set the cup beside the flowers. The smoke from the cigar drifted off the cliff and was taken into the clean, bright wind and was gone. He liked his sake. He liked his cigars. He liked beautiful women. He never married any of them. Miranda waited. "There was one," Lucian said. He did not look at her. He was looking at the carving. "Years before I came here, the story I was told, often. The previous Dragon King fell in love with a human woman the way the Dragon Kings fall in love. Once. Completely. Permanently. They were going to perform the dragon mate ceremony in the spring. She died in the autumn. Some kind of accident on a road. She was simply alive in the morning and not alive at dinner. He could not heal what had no soul left in it to heal. So he did not. Her chest had gone very still. He kept lovers afterward. He never proposed. He never ceased grieving. The reign over the castle started the night she died. It did not stop while he was alive. He told me, when he was dying, that he had not been able to stop it because the part of him that controlled it had broken on a road in autumn. He said, "Do not lose yours." He said, "If you find her, do not let go." She felt the tears before she felt them. The 5th stage of crying, the dissolved one, the one that came after restraint and after release and after grief, the one that simply leaked from a place that had been closed for so long the body had not entirely remembered the door was there. They went down her face. She did not put up her hand. She did not wipe them away. They were not for her. She wept for Gerald, who had loved a woman who had been alive in a morning and not alive at dinner. She wept for the man on a cliff looking at the rain and not being able to stop it. She wept for the long, quiet years of a king who had kept many lovers and had never said yes to one, because he had said it to one, and one had been all of his yes there was, and she had not been there to hear it. She wept because Lucian had almost been him. She wept because she had almost been her. She had not been. He had not been. They had stood on an altar 4 months ago, and the road between 2 countries had done its actual job, and Gerald had been right. Lucian's hand found hers in the long grass. He did not say anything. He had nothing to say about Gerald. He was simply present. She wiped her face on the back of her wrist when she was done. The sun had moved. The shadow of the tombstone had lengthened across the grass. "Lucian, I want to come back here. Yes. I want to bring him news. I want him to know we are doing all right. I want him to know I am here. I want him to know you are not alone. Yes. I want to come back every year." He pressed his thumb across her knuckles. I will bring you back whenever you wish, any time, as often as you ask. He will be very pleased to have a visitor." She laid her cheek on his shoulder. The wind moved across the cliff. The cigar burned down to its first soft inch of ash. The sake in the small cup caught the late sun and was the color of a window left open into a warmer country. Below them, the dragon forest was every shade of summer, and somewhere down there were a small black dragon judging an unsanctioned foot race, and a small horned boy filing a great many things, and a castle with no clutter, and a kitchen with a stove she was going to learn to start eventually if Lucian taught her one more time. The scar on the inside of his left forearm, the long, thin, pale line from the cliff at Galena, where he had opened himself up to bring Pluto back, was very faintly visible under the cuff of his rolled sleeve. Some nights he still woke reaching. Some afternoons the rain still started for no reason and took an hour to remember itself. The wound from the iron room of Ukreis did not vanish. The boy who had been kept in a ballroom was still inside the man who held her hand. She had learned not to ask him to be over it. She had learned to be there. The waiting was its own form of staying. The dragon forest stretched beneath them in the long, late sun. Behind them, far back over the green hills, the dragon castle stood on its slow, small hill at the heart of his country, with its tall windows and its single round courtyard, and above the dragon castle, where for 11 years there had been weather, there was clean blue sky. The rain had finally stopped.